I'm Brian Eyler, coming to you from the Stimson Center in Washington, D.C. I first traveled to the Mekong 20 years ago, and I was in southwest China, where I visited the construction sites of some of the largest dams in the world. They were being built at a time when I couldn't really understand the environmental impacts that they would deliver downstream to countries like Vietnam 20 years later. Since that first visit to the Mekong, I've taken countless trips from China to Vietnam, traveling the entirety of the Mekong, talking to fishers and farmers and experts and local community people and government officials to learn about how life is changing along this mighty river and how dams are bringing about some of that change. I took what I learned from them and put it into a book called Last Days of the Mighty Mekong, which came out a few years ago. And in my book, I tell a story about how I went to Vietnam's Mekong Delta in April of 2016, at the time of what was then the worst drought in memory. I saw cracked earth and ruined rice crops and talked to people who were pitched to the point of a near water and food security crisis. I learned a lot from that trip, and I put it into the book, but I also put it into what I do day to day at the Stimson Center. And that is help shine a light on what the impacts of dams are doing to the Mekong and provide solutions on how to improve the situation. And while stuck in the United States during the pandemic, my team, including my colleague Courtney Weatherby, we've put together the Mekong Dam Monitor, which is an online platform that you can access to see what the impacts of dams are. You can follow this in real time and learn how to adapt and understand about these impacts.
And I'm Courtney Weatherby. For generations, my family has spent part of every year alongside a small lake in upstate New York, fishing, boating, and hiking. Each year, it was a treasured opportunity for us to connect with one another and for us to connect with nature. But in recent years, I've seen how logging and dam operations have significantly altered that lake and the landscape around it. This motivates me to focus on finding ways to conserve the environment. In addition to the work that Brian and I do on the Mekong Dam Monitor, we have long engaged with communities in Vietnam, Cambodia, Laos, and Thailand who depend on the Mekong River. In traveling around to these communities, we hear firsthand how families are affected by a changing environment. We listen to their needs, we match those needs with solutions, and then we bring those solutions to changemakers in Vietnam and around the region. When Brian and I talk with changemakers in Vietnam, we promote pathways for Vietnam to meet its energy needs while protecting that which makes the Mekong River's ecosystem unique.
So today, Courtney and I are going to introduce an idea to you that we think will help save the Mekong Delta. And the very existence of the Mekong Delta, Vietnam's food basket, is threatened by upstream dams, outdated local planning, and the way that climate change is impacting the Delta. And without proper action, the Mekong Delta, home to almost 20 million people, could fall into the sea in just a few decades. So Vietnam needs to make smart planning approaches both at home and with its neighbors to keep the Delta alive and thriving. And to introduce our idea, we're going to talk about a sports analogy. Courtney and I have been paying a lot of attention to the massive success of Vietnam's national football team. There's been a lot of improvement in recent years, and we see the pride of Vietnam, the pride of the people of Vietnam in Vietnam's national football team. And we think a lot of that improvement has come in the way that Vietnam has improved its away game. That is, its ability to play outside of Vietnam and win games. Now, every sports team needs to both be able to play well at home and have a good home game in front of crowds and fans that love and adore them, as well as to be able to travel away and play in places where they're not so comfortable but still win. So to come back to our main idea of a good away game, a better away game for Vietnam in the Mekong Delta is really under threat. And by our own read of Vietnam's home game is quite good. It includes great ideas like replacing too much rice with higher value agricultural crops that brings more income to people in Vietnam, as well as letting nature do the work to save and conserve the natural resource base of the Mekong Delta for the first time in a really long time. These are all great ideas, But without a better away game, all that good work of the home game could come undone. So how can Vietnam improve its away game to save the Mekong Delta? We think that Vietnam now urgently needs to engage its neighbors Laos and Cambodia and to teach the neighbors about the promises and benefits of solar and wind. And importantly, smartly convince its neighbors not to site dams and build dams on parts of the Mekong that are harmful to the Mekong Delta downstream of Vietnam. So think back to how Courtney talked about her time at the lake in New York State. And she saw changes brought by loggers and dam operators to that experience. How do you see changes happening in the Mekong Delta? How do you think and feel about the impacts that dams far upstream are delivering to the Mekong Delta? Now, to be sure, hydropower dams, and those are dams that use water to produce electricity, have a lot of benefits. They're providing lots of electricity to people in the region. They're lighting up cities and lifting people out of poverty. But dams also have environmental impacts. Some of the impacts are they cut off fish migration routes in the Mekong. They prevent sediment from flowing downstream. That sediment is needed in the delta. And they also reduce freshwater access. Now, one dam delivers this set of changes. Can you imagine what lots of dams together do? Those changes are really severe and they can be very impactful. So just how many dams are built upstream of Vietnam? Well, we've found that there are at least 140 hydropower dams built upstream of Vietnam. 13 are on the Mekong mainstream, and the rest are on the numerous tributaries of the Mekong. But importantly, there could be 280 more dams built upstream. That's what the plans say. And most of these dams will be built in Laos. Now, Laos intends to build those dams not for its own use of electricity, but to sell that power to Vietnam and Thailand. So here's where you come in. If Vietnam is going to buy electricity from Laos, how can Vietnam improve its away game so that it buys electricity from Laos in a way that doesn't hurt the Mekong Delta? And what can you do about it? Well, since investment in these dams in Laos is foreign-led, you have an opportunity to advocate for a smarter cooperation strategy with Laos and Cambodia, a smarter away game that can minimize the negative environmental and social impacts. So let's look at an example of how this can be done by taking a look at the Sekong River, the longest undammed tributary in the Mekong. The Sekong River is a transboundary river that rises in Vietnam's Toi Thien Huay province. It flows through much of southern Laos and then enters the Mekong in Cambodia. I have concerns about a new dam now planned to be built on the Sekong River. It's called the Sekong A Dam, and it would be built just a few kilometers upstream from Laos's border with Cambodia. It's a relatively small dam, and it's being built by Vietnamese companies. Yet, because of its location on the Sekong mainstream, the Sekong A Dam will have serious impacts on fisheries and sediment flow to the Mekong Delta. And to understand why these impacts will be so profound, we have to look at another dam in Cambodia, not too far from the Sekong A Dam. In 2018, the Lower Say Son 2 Dam was completed. Its reservoir created a large inland sea, and it cut off two of the longest tributaries of the whole Mekong Basin, the Srei Pak River and the Say Son River. And science predicted that this dam alone would cut the entire fish population of the Mekong by 10%. And now that the dam is operating, new research shows that fish are adapting to the new situation and are starting to use the Sekong River to migrate upstream and spawn. So this makes the Sekong the most vital tributary for fish migration in the entirety of the Mekong. And this is why it needs to remain free-flowing with no dams on its mainstream. Leaving the Sekong River free-flowing will also keep sediment and fish flowing freely to the Mekong Delta downstream. Finding alternative options to the Sekong A Dam and other dams with similarly serious impacts is vital to conserve the existing resource flow to the Mekong Delta.
And to understand how we can consider these trade-offs in the Sekong, we need to look at the big picture. It's really important to know that while there are more than 280 new dams under consideration for development upstream of Vietnam's Mekong Delta, not all of these projects will actually be built. So Vietnam has opportunities to strategically negotiate to replace some of the worst most impactful dams, like the Sekong A Dam, with less impactful dams, or even with alternative energy sources. Vietnam has already pledged to reduce coal from its own energy mix and to increase its electricity imports from Laos. Vietnam's decisions about which projects to invest in and purchase electricity from in Laos will ultimately impact which projects move forward, and thus impact sediment flow to the Mekong Delta and fish migration throughout the Mekong River system. The location of a dam matters. Dams that are built upstream of existing dams will have fewer impacts on environmental flows and connectivity than a dam built on a currently free-flowing stretch of river. A dam that is close to the confluence of a tributary with the mainstream of the Mekong, or like the Lower Sesan 2 Dam that Brian mentioned, close to the confluence of two tributaries, will cut off a relatively large amount of connected river system when you compare that to a dam that's built farther upstream, near the headwaters of a river. Vietnam can strategically negotiate with Laos to target its investment and the purchase of electricity only towards projects which have a minimal negative impact on the delta in order to protect downstream communities. This could include some specifically identified hydropower dams. But more importantly, it opens Vietnam's away game wide for the promotion of alternative renewable energy sources. And here we come to an important point. If Vietnam improves its away game, it can promote sustainable development with its neighbors. In this way, it's not only acting in its own best interests, but it's looking at the bigger picture and looking for a brighter future for the region as a whole. You know, and I know, that we live in an ever-changing world. Technology is constantly evolving. You might be wondering, is it feasible for new forms of energy like solar and wind to make a difference? Can these new energy technologies actually replace dams? Brian and I are firm believers that solar and wind projects can substitute for some of the most impactful hydropower projects. Laos and Cambodia are both rich in untapped renewable energy potential, particularly solar and wind. These renewable energy sources not only can help reduce carbon emissions by substituting for coal plants, but could be used as a direct replacement for some of the riskiest and most impactful dams to the Mekong Delta in Vietnam. And unlike dams, solar and wind projects don't impact river connectivity at all. And they're also increasingly affordable sources of electricity. You might be surprised to learn that over the last 10 years, the price of solar and wind have dropped drastically and become very competitive with traditional sources of power like coal or hydropower. Just in the last 5 years, Vietnam alone has built more than 16,000 megawatts of new solar projects. Vietnamese investment firms and construction companies now have broad expertise in these types of projects, and they can take that experience in building wind and solar at home to their neighbors in Laos and Cambodia, and share this success story and share those lessons. These new technologies open the door to reducing pressure on the Mekong Delta. But this away game needs to be smartly coordinated, because unless Vietnam engages with a big picture, it's possible for Vietnam on one hand to support the renewable energy transition in its neighbors, but on the other hand, also invest in just one impactful dam, like the Sekong A Dam, which could devastate the delta and harm the livelihoods of millions who rely on it. So to conserve the Mekong Delta, solar and wind farms need to be strategically used as a replacement for dams, which are particularly impactful. So looking back to the Sekong A Dam that we've been talking about, that project only provides 86 megawatts of electricity. That's a minuscule amount of electricity compared to Vietnam's future electricity demand. But that location for that dam would cut off a huge portion of the Sekong River from the rest of the Mekong. But there are alternative options available. For instance, Vietnam could invest in one or two of the alternative hydropower sites that are built further upstream and located off the mainstream of the Sekong and higher up in the river system, meaning they'd have more limited impacts on fish migration and sediment flow to the delta. Laos also has thousands of megawatts of solar and wind potential, including within the 3S basin, that are just waiting for investment and development. And have you heard about floating solar? Floating solar power uses the surface of an existing dam reservoir as a space to build a large solar project. Floating solar can reduce competition over land use, and it makes use of existing electricity transmission infrastructure, avoiding the need for further construction. There are at least 4 projects within the Sekong Basin in Laos which could potentially be a good host for a floating solar project. And just one of those dam reservoirs could potentially provide more solar electricity capacity than the entire Sekong A Dam. So with a smart away game, any 1 or 2 of these alternatives could replace the Sekong A Dam and help conserve resources for the Mekong Delta.
Now, in recent years, Courtney and I have looked at the plans. We know what dams could be built in Laos and what Vietnam's interested in. And we think that right now is the time for Vietnam to play that smarter away game, because there are lots of options. So here's where you come in. Go out and tell your neighbors in Cambodia and Laos about Vietnam's amazing success story in adding more and more solar and wind inside of Vietnam. And do this in a way that encourages these countries to substitute solar and wind for the most impactful dams. And a good first step is to go and talk to a local change maker, someone who can advocate for those alternatives to the Sekong A Dam. Because if the Sekong A Dam is built, it would be devastating to the Mekong Delta. It would dismantle the good work done by Vietnam's home game. Now, doing this and taking these steps will continue to ensure Vietnam's energy security success. And it will help Laos and Cambodia develop in a more sustainable way. And most importantly, taking these steps will help conserve the existing sediment flow and the fisheries migration and the fresh water to the Mekong Delta, keeping it healthier and intact in the face of increasing climate change impacts. Thank you very much.
Thank you.